on, pep rally. Yeah, didn't you like pep rallies? So let me give you some preambles to Thomas Aquinas and what we read. We had already talked about this in some of the first lectures about how do you divide up sciences. Now, one thing, or disciplines, one thing that Thomas Aquinas was known for as far as contributing is there was a certain problem that happened in the medieval ages in scholasticism, and this is where a problem that arose because people were not drawing out the distinctions or demarcations between the different disciplines. So what discipline studies what subject matter, and when does one discipline go out of bounds and start talking about subjects and areas that it's not supposed to. And one of the problems was that theology had become so dominant and blurred the distinctions that other disciplines weren't able to operate autonomously. So, for example, theology would dictate philosophy and science. What Aquinas contributed to, one of the things that he contributed that was remarkable was to be able, he wrote a work called On the Divisions of Sciences, where he lays out the demarcation issue. And first he states that every science is defined by its subject matter, that it desires or attempts to study or attempts to know. And remember, scientia in Latin means knowledge. And you can create a science in the traditional sense without actually knowing anything, because first you need a roadmap in order to know what is it that I'm going to study in hopes of knowing. So that's what a science in the traditional sense is the discipline dedicated at knowing a particular subject matter. It's no guarantee that you'll know it, but it's dedicated and aiming towards that subject matter, and that therefore that subject matter defines the particular science or discipline. And he also states that every science has axioms and definitions that its discipline is based on. For example, the science of numbers and magnitudes, i.e. mathematics, has numbers, points, lines, and axioms as their basic principles. Let me pause real quick and tell you that unfortunately in the book, there was preceding, in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, before you get to the question about whether God exists, he had another article where he asks, does the question of whether God exists, can that be demonstrated, or is that something that's just taken on pure blind faith? What would you say? Now, it doesn't mean, it's another question whether one can make a demonstration or has, but first things first, Aquinas asks, what category does it even fall into? Is the existence of God something that ought to just be taken on faith, or is it categorically something that could be demonstrated using philosophy, logic, and reasoning? Show of hands, how many people would say, no, whether or not God exists or not, I'd put it in the category of it's faith? Who would say whether or not you could prove or demonstrate or offer arguments? No, I actually think that it would fall into the category of arguments or demonstration using logic. Show of hands. Well, because Aquinas is an Aristotelian, I remember we said that a good Aristotelian answer is always to answer in a way yes, in a way no. And what he says is that it depends on what subject or discipline you're raising the question in. if you're raising it within theology, theology takes its basic principles, and basic principles, this is why I mentioned mathematics, does not try to prove or demonstrate the existence of numbers, points, lines, and the various other axioms. And you will find this in every discipline. They have founding principles and definitions and axioms that are taken on faith. We assume them, not prove them, and then from those assumptions you can build a demonstrative science, i.e. mathematics. For theology, the basic axioms or first principles is God or the sacred text associated with God. So do you see he's making a clear distinction and saying, well, if you're going to be doing theology, which is theos in Greek, the study of God and the sacred text and traditions associated with that, then yes, you take God on faith, just like you do in every other science. Whether it be physics, whether it be mathematics, you take the first principles on faith and then you build from there. For example, let me just show you how an example using Euclidean geometry, how taking first principles on faith, how you can actually have knowledge. Now, Aristotle brings this up and says, look, whatever proposition you think is true, if you ask, well, why is that true? You're going to say, well, because this is true, and because this is true. Now, just like the turtles all the way down, we know if that just keeps going, if everything's dependent on something else for its explanation all the way down towards infinity with no end, then you have no foundation for anything. If it does not ground out in something that no longer requires another demonstration or proof, then it really is just an infinite passing the bucks of explanations, in which case you can have no knowledge. Aristotle identified that, and therefore he said, and this really is the beginnings of what we call foundational epistemology, because it requires, in order to know something, it requires a bedrock in which everything else is founded on. And if you asked, how do you know that foundation? You assume it. There is no other demonstration, because then it has to... Now, there might be good reasons to, but it's not going to be another proof of another proof of another proof forever and forever, all the way down. So look how this works, for example, in Euclidean geometry. Euclid starts off by just defining, and we assume as rather than prove that these are true. A point is that which has no part. A line is a breadthless link. Now that I have these two things, you could even define a circle is from the center, all equal radii. If you drew that around, you have a circle. Now watch this. Now you know that every radii in a circle is equal, correct? By definition. Let me get a... So let's call this circle A. And we can have that is point A, is the center, and this is point B. Let point B be the center, and BA be the radius for the second circle. Now, if I draw from circle B, the center, to the circumference, any line to the circumference from the center is a radii. So let's draw this. Call that BC, point C. Now look at circle A. And if I draw from center A up to the circumference, that's another radii. Then I have all equal radii, and therefore I've actually demonstrated that I can construct an equilateral triangle just based off of first principles and assumptions. And from a triangle, then I can start making more demonstrations about, do all angles equal 180 degrees? On a right angle, do the squares, the area on the squares of the side equal the area of the hypotenuse? And you develop a whole demonstrative science. This is kind of an archetype for the way all disciplines in sciences work. So Aquinas says, yes, God's existence is taken on faith if you're doing theology, because theology's first principles is theos, God, and the sacred text associated with it. If you're doing philosophy, though, and because philosophy considers all things humanly knowable, or potentially knowable, as far as the categories, the things you can study, nothing's off limits, including God. If you're doing what we call natural philosophy, or philosophy, God's existence cannot be taken on faith. It must fall into the category of being demonstrated using logic. That is what Aquinas. So in a way, yes, in a way, no. Doing theology, you take it on faith. If you're doing philosophy, God's existence falls into the category of something that must be demonstrated. Questions about that? And that's typically called natural philosophy because, as I said, Aquinas is going to use Aristotle's thinking that all knowledge comes from experience, sense experience, i.e. nature. So anything that you're going to reason about God doing philosophy is going to be from sense experience. And therefore, it gets this fancy title, natural philosophy. And that type of argumentation is called cosmological arguments for the existence of God. There are several types, as we identified: cosmological argument, ontological arguments, and teleological arguments, and then one final one that I'll talk to you about later called transcendental arguments. But cosmological arguments begin from some fact in your sense experience, and then they reason to an ultimate cause or explanation for that fact. Therefore, all cosmological arguments are a movement from effect to cause. Now, let me just explain something real quick. Aristotle says, in your mode of knowing anything, let's put modes of knowing, first you will establish that something is. Once you establish that something exists or that it is, you're going to want to know what it is, i.e. its essence. That's not strange. Think about it. What the heck is that? Do you see that? Well, the first thing that I know is that there's something there, but I don't know number two. Well, what is it? So, check. We know that something exists, but I can't figure it out. Then I go to investigate it and I go, oh, it's just a shadow. It's not a monster. It's not a person. And so I get this. When it comes to reasoning about God, Almost all theologians will say number one is as far as you can get. You can know that something is, but you can never know what God is, and that's because, as most theologians would say, you can't know God's essence. And as we get into the arguments later, I'll explain why that follows. So how can you say something is if you don't know what you're talking about? Well, because we have something called the principle of sufficient reasoning, meaning every effect has a cause or an explanation. If you're driving on the freeway and you see a car pile up and somebody said, well, why did that happen? Wouldn't it be strange if somebody said, no reason. There's no reason in the universe why that happened. It just is. Well, you could say, well, dang it, you violated the principle of sufficient reason and you're going straight to hell. No, you don't need to say that latter part. You just say the first part. That's because we know every effect has a cause. And notice, although you don't know what the cause is, number two, the very first thing that you notice on the freeway when you see the car pile up, a cause exists. Why? Because you see the effect of it, even though you weren't there around to sense the cause. In a like manner, that type of cosmological reasoning, a posteriori reasoning, is used when it comes to cosmological arguments. Because God is not a sensible being, has no physical body to be sensed. Therefore, what cosmological arguments will simply do is look at the effects in nature and your sense experience, and they reason to an ultimate explanation for that. So it's either turtles all the way down, and you keep just going, well, that explanation entails that forever and ever, in which case you're just passing the buck. You're not getting an actual explanation for anything in nature or reason why anything's happening. Or the second option is, no, it ultimately grounds out into something that needs no other explanation and therefore ends up being an ultimate foundational cause for whatever you're experiencing in nature. That is cosmological arguments. Ontological arguments, on the other hand, are not a posteriori. They are a priori. They begin with definitions or pure concepts in the mind. Something like, by definition, the whole is greater than the part. How do you know that? I don't have to draw a pie chart up for you because it's definitionally true. Part means a fraction or piece of the whole. Therefore, it follows that the whole will be greater than the part. That is an a priori argument. So if you have something like a definition or concept without recourse to any sense experience, and you start with that in the mind, and based on the very meaning of that term or concept, you end up concluding, oh, it doesn't just exist in my mind, but because of the meaning of that term, it exists outside my mind as well, i.e. God. Then you've made what we call an ontological argument. Immanuel Kant was the first one to coin that term, ontological argument, referring to René Descartes' arguments for the existence of God. It later becomes attributed in a strange way and maybe incorrectly to Anselm of Canterbury. And it's been called the ontological argument. There's reasons, though, that we might think that it's not an ontological argument. One of which is because Descartes comes way after Anselm, and Kant, who uses the term ontological, is referring to Descartes. So why should we think that it refers to his predecessor, Anselm? Teleological arguments. Telos, dealing with final causality. So if you make any type of argument based on ordered things in nature being ordered to an end, or fine-tuning, and then conclude in God's existence, then you're making a teleological argument. There are two different types of teleological arguments. There can be one that's a non-design argument, meaning just you're looking at nature, and don't you notice that acorns are always growing into oak trees, the end. the telos. If you make an argument from that to conclude in God's existence, then you're making a non-design teleological argument. If you conclude, well, it's because the acorn had to be designed, then you're making a design argument that's teleological. Do you see the distinction? So I'm trying to point out not every teleological argument is a design argument. In fact, I'm going to argue that Aquinas' fifth way, although all 5 arguments are cosmological arguments, the fifth way is a teleological argument as well, but it's not a design argument. If you looked it up online, I'm sure people will tell you that it is a design argument, but there's all kinds of junk on the internet that you shouldn't believe. So,
can you repeat the difference between non-design and design arguments?
So, one, they're both talking about an end or purpose. There is a way to talk about purpose and ends in nature. For example, Aristotle does. Aristotle doesn't believe God is either a creator or a designer. So you could still make an argument from Aristotle that for God's existence without having to use the concept that these things were designed that way or created that way in nature. You could also make an argument that's teleological by saying that what's so fine-tuned that it must be designed. Now, the famous design argument is William Paley's The Watchmaker, which is in your book. You can read it, but it goes something like this, that you clearly know the difference between those things that are designed and those things that are not designed. And if you were to be walking on a desert island and find a watch, would you conclude, wow, that's amazing what that palm tree produced, or what nature? You would realize that it was the byproduct of some type of intelligent design. And then he makes the analogy, but nature is so finely tuned and complicated that it too must be concluded that it must require a designer. There's issues with that I'll bring up later. But that's the distinction, is one, you can make a teleological argument without implying a designer. So, and God can create without being a designer. Design seems to be something that's fairly anthropomorphic, that applies to human beings but may not apply to God. I don't want to go too far I don't want to get ahead of myself. But those are, and the last one is a transcendental argument. And the transcendental argument, rather than God being the conclusion of an argument, God ends up being the necessary conditions for any arguments whatsoever. So if I asked you, well, how did you bake that cake? Did it just come into being what were the necessary ingredients or conditions? You'd say, well, a cake baker, flour, eggs, water, salt. These things don't give you a cake. They're what's necessary to a transcendental argument is something similar, and it says, how can you have knowledge? What are the necessary conditions for? And oftentimes it can be summarized like this in kind of a dialogue between the atheist and the theist. The atheist turns to the theist who believes in God and says, you have no reason to believe in God. And the theist responds to the atheist, but you have no God to believe in reason. You have no foundation. You're just asserting that you think you know things and you can use these faculties and that you're not schizophrenic and that your organs are working correctly. That's just pure blind faith and assumptions. You have no grounding. They're very powerful arguments, and I'll get into that later. But we'll focus on Aquinas first. Aquinas is very systematic in his thought, and I'm going to outline how Aquinas puts together his writings in the Summa Theologica, what you will get is question and article. Questions, and you'll have parts. You'll have like part 1, part 2. So question will be something within general theme about, for example, if part 1's about God, then questions will be something specific about that. And then an article within a questions get even more specific. So it's just kind of being very ordered and dividing it down into the proper distinctions. The prior, and it's too bad your book didn't include this, but question 2 is about God's existence. The articles are something specific about God's existence. The prior article to Article 3 is actually asking, does God's existence fall into the category of faith, or is it something that could be possibly or categorically within the realm of demonstration using logic and syllogisms? So notice that first things first, he's going to answer questions, and he's going to take you through in a very ordered manner in answering these. And that's what we addressed prior. Then, once he established and make the distinction that if you're doing theology, you take it like any other science, as a basic principle, you take on faith and assume it, you don't prove it. But if you're doing philosophy, God has to be something that's not taken on faith. It needs to be something demonstrated. Next question is, well, can you demonstrate it? Do you see how nice and ordered that is? We also talked about you don't want to straw man your opponent's position. That is called the fallacy of what? The straw man fallacy. Making a little straw man so you can easily knock it down. You want to apply the rule of charity and either correctly represent your opponent's position or make it even stronger than they do. Because then if you can knock it down, which is what you do want to do, in philosophy, you want to set up the problem and then solve it, offer a response. You want to do it in a charitable way and one that reflects best on you. This is exactly what Aquinas does. So in his articles, he always finds the best objection and strongest objections. And it's very interesting. I've studied all the arguments for the existence of God and against God. And I'll tell you what, nothing's changed from what Aquinas has outlined. These are still today the most difficult objections to God's existence and can be summarized. I'll get into that later. But so he will state the objections first, and he will typically put them into a syllogistic format so that you can analyze the logic of it much easier. Then after the objections comes the but against, which in Latin is called the sed contra. That's not an argument, it's just something to kind of give you pause. That he'll typically quote some authority just to get you to stop and think, you know what, there's other people who are authorities that might say something different. So he might quote Aristotle, which he never calls Aristotle, he just calls him the philosopher, as if there was only one that reached that level to just get the unique title of the philosopher. Everybody else is just an imitation. He's the real thing. Or he might quote something from the Bible, like St. Paul states in his letter to the Romans, blah, 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 blah. And it's just supposed to make you go, oh, okay, there might be another answer to that. Now, after the sed contra comes the body of his article and argument, which we call in Latin the corpus, body. And in this is where he'll put the detailed argument of the question and article he's trying to answer. So that's his main argument. After that is what we call the respondio, the responses to the objections. Because he's already provided his argument for, let's say, the existence of God, but you still need to address the objections. What went wrong with the logic of the argument and the objections? That's what the respondio is. So he presents a very nice case. The best objections, a quote to make you pause and think there might be a different answer, the main argument, and then a response to all the objections. It's very systematic. Questions about that so far?
What was the part before the objections from like the other philosophers?
The sed contra.
Before that?
The objections, the sed contra, the corpus, and the respondio. So Aquinas says there's 5 ways to demonstrate the existence of God. There's a famous painting of him doing this, going through. And he sets it up in a systematic way, what he thinks is most obvious and your sense experience. And as we talked about with Plato and the pre-Socratics and Heraclitus, the most obvious thing when you look around is things are moving and changing. And he wants to know, well, what explains that? You just say, it just is. There's no explanation, just things. So he will base an argument on motion and change and conclude in the existence of God as being the foundational answer that explains that. The second way is something more specific. It's about efficient causality. So like push and pulls. The third way is about kind of existence and the way things can exist. Things can exist as just possible existence, contingent. Like you're at a contingent. If there was no sun, then it'd be too cold for us to come into existence. So we're contingent upon that fact. You're also contingent upon the fact that you need parents. There's a whole host of things. And so you can divide the world up into 2 categories, conceptual categories of the way things exist. Either they're dependent and simply only possible. In other words, if it wasn't for a sun and your parents and all these different factors, well, you wouldn't exist. So your existence is only a possible existence, not a necessary. Then the other one would be the things that would exist that are not dependent on anything else. They're self-sufficient. And therefore, they exist necessarily. He makes an argument based on these 2 concepts of the way things could exist and concludes the existence of God, and that's called the third way, the argument from the possibility and necessity. Know the names of these. Don't make them up. Don't try to summarize them in your own words, because they will be on your quiz and test. And when in doubt, just look in your book. It's like the first line of each paragraph says, this is the argument from motion and change. This is the argument from efficient causality. This is the argument from possibility and necessity. The fourth way is one from gradation. Things admit when you look around in the world, and if your sense experience, you notice things having more or less. Something's more beautiful than something else. Something's hotter than something's heavier, but doesn't more or less admit of a standard. How can you say something's more beautiful than another thing or more green if there is no standard called green or beautiful? So he makes that argument and concludes that God is obviously the standard by which we say something falls short more or less. And the fifth way is not a design argument. He does not say that. So just use his own words. He says it's an argument from the governance of the world, which is a type of teleological argument. So those are the names of Aquinas' 5 ways. Questions so far? And I'll put this up for you too online so you have the slides and you can look over. So that's just, again, illustrating. Aquinas' fifth way is a cosmological argument that's also a teleological argument. We identify teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means end. And teleology is something we see exemplified in nature. Aristotle's famous dictum, nature always acts for an end, always or for the most part. And we put up this nice picture of, look at the acorn. Why does it grow into, why does it have a sprout? Sprouts for the next stage, for the next stage. Each thing is for the final product. And so there is no randomness in nature, that there's a program, a genetic program in there guiding it to its fulfillment. That's simply teleology. Okay, let's go over the first way. Let's start with the general notion of change, because motion is a type of change. It's a change of place. If I have a glass of cold water, cold water is not hot, but it's potentially hot. And what did we say change was according to Aristotle's definition? That's right. So if this becomes actually hot water, then the process of this moving from being only potentially hot, i.e. cold, to actually hot is exactly what you said. That's called change. Now, how does that process happen? Just common sense. Do I just keep adding more and more potentially hot things like ice cubes? And do two potencies equal in actuality? How do I make the cold water into hot water? I mean, just practically speaking. If I could, yeah, that's right. And you add heat, something actually hot. I can't just keep adding more and more potential hot things. You have to add something actually hot to make what's in potency into actuality. Then you can ask, okay, well, was that always just actually hot forever? Or did something change it? And you could say, well, there was just wood there, which is potentially hot, that was made actually hot into a fire. Well, how? By something else. It was, let's say, a match, a burning match that was actually hot. So it takes the wood that's potentially hot, because the fire is actually hot, makes what's potential and changes it to become actually hot. What's actually hot makes the cold water, which is potentially hot, into actual hot water. And you can trace that series of explanations or causes back and say, well, what about the match? Was it always actually burning and hot? Well, no. It had chemicals in that were potentially could be ignited and make something actually. And you could just keep going. And so you can see where this is going. Either that series is infinite, it just keeps going, or it lands at a first. Aquinas says, and by the way, these arguments are not even Aquinas's. They're all in Aristotle. Aristotle made all these arguments already. So he's just using and explaining these arguments in his own way. But Aristotle concludes in this as well, that no, if things just, each explanation or cause just went on forever back towards infinity, then no, you would get, nothing would change. Because interesting enough, if you know anything about calculus or the notion of infinity, between any 2 points on a line, there are an infinite amount of points. So between any two, if this causes this to change, well, if that went back on an infinite series, in an infinite series between any 2 points, there's also an infinite amount of causes too. So you never even get to, the match could never actually cause the wood to, because it would have to go through an infinite amount of other things as well.
Wasn't that like debunked in Zeno's paradox?
No, so nobody ever refuted, nobody ever denied the principle that you can't, this is called the famous dictum that all the philosophers and Greeks would refer to, you cannot transverse an infinite series. So the way that Aristotle refuted that was not by saying, yes, you can. He said you're confusing categories. You're dividing a line while at the same time composing time parts. So you're making a category mistake. But he believed, like most philosophers, that no, that was the strength of Zeno's argument, is that everybody knows you can't go through an infinite amount of points or infinite series. Let me put this in now a more specific way about motion. Now you can think about, in change, it takes actuality to make what's only in potency to become something actual. Now, if everything was an infinite series, if there was no first, then what we'd be saying is that no answers, only potential answers, which are not actual answers. If you just get enough of no answers together, it just adds up magically to be an explanation for things. If you have enough partial explanations, but we know that can't be true. You can't just keep saying, passing the buck forever. And I'm not getting an explanation because you're referring to the next person who refers to the next person. Clearly, if it doesn't ground out in somebody that actually has the actual answer, then you're not going to get an explanation for anything. So there's something similar going on in this reasoning. But it might help to think about this in terms of motion, where I can set up a syllogism using premises. Everything that is moved, now I'm using the passive sense of the verb. I'm not saying everything moving in the state of moving. It's passive. Everything that is moved by something other than itself, and that by another. In other words, nothing can be the source of its own motion, because it takes motion to move something. And if you're in a state of rest, how are you going to move yourself if you have no motion? So nothing can be the source of its own motion. It must require other explanations of motion outside of itself. In other words, this just ends up being definitionally true. Everything moved is moved by another. That's like saying everybody hit is being hit. That can't be false. That's just definitionally true. So that's not controversial premise. Premise 2, the series of mover moved is either 1, infinite, meaning having no beginning or first, or it has a beginning, a first. Now that's just an either or. That's like saying either there's a pen in my hand or there's not a pen in my hand. Either she's pregnant or she's not pregnant right now. You can't say, yeah, but maybe there's a third option. It's like, no, not in the same way at the same time. There couldn't be. And so that sets up for what we talked about, the process of elimination. If you boil something down to it can only either be option A or B, and you know it can't be B, then it must be A. So that's what he's setting up. That's not controversial because I can't think of a third way. Either that series of mover moved has no beginning, it's infinite, or it does have a beginning. Pretty clear, straightforward. Here is the controversial premise. It is logically impossible to an infinite series. Meaning number 2, 1 must be false. Oh, sorry. That's right. Number 2, 1. That this can't be true, therefore there must be a first cause to motion and change. Now, because I told you we can never know the essence of God or what God is, this is why Aquinas will say, and this is what all men call God. So each conclusion just ends up being a name for God because you can't actually comprehend God's essence. And I'll explain later why that theologically is the case. Sound good? Questions before we leave on that? So we've covered the first way. On Monday, we will cover the other way. So think of possible objections to this. That's what you always want to do when going through arguments, is that you try to first understand what the argument is saying, then try to come up with your